Hey everyone, welcome to another AskGN episode. This is the third one of 3 I've shot today. It's getting real late. It's about 3 a.m. and after this I have to edit the rest of the David Cantor interview, have to make some changes to the day 4 vlog, go to sleep, wake up in a couple hours, and move this thing into the new office. So I just went over all that in the Patreon episode on patreon.com/gamersnexus. If you want some behind the scenes info, it will be in there. We had audio issues in that one. Hopefully they're not too bad, but anyway. There's a lot going on right now, and it's hard to keep up with. So this AskGN, as always, post your questions in the comment section below. If you have them, we'll try and get them next time. This is likely the last AskGN I will be shooting in this location. We'll pick up the series in the new location shortly after this, and may have already done so by the time this one goes live. So let's get into it. Before that, this video is brought to you by the Corsair Strafe RGB Mark II mechanical gaming keyboard. The Strafe Mark II uses Cherry MX switches, available in MX Red and MX Silent, and uses the elevated keycap design that has become part of Corsair's keyboard identity. Elevated keycaps make the keyboard much easier to clean with a blast of compressed air and limit dirt buildup. The keyboards use a metal body design and have received praise from us in the past in old reviews for high build quality. Learn more about the Corsair Strafe Mark II at the link in the description below. First of all, quick housekeeping stuff. Thank you very much to all the programmers last episode. I was answering a question about optimization. I gave some of my thoughts on like GPU and CPU optimization. And then I asked any programmers in the audience, because I know there are a lot of you out there, to please comment with your own experience below. And you did. And man, there is some really insightful stuff there. I learned a lot from it, and I hope others did too. So thank you very much for sharing. We should basically start a TellGN series too, that some of you have joked about, so that I can learn from you all who are experts in various fields. Anyway, thank you for doing that. And also, quick note, store.gamersnexus.net still has a lot of stock, finally, of the GN teardown crystals, where we have, it's a really sweet like 3D logo with really high resolution print in it, of the GN logo, except torn down with various PCB components on it, like MOSFETs, inductors, fans, stuff like that. So if you look at it kind of closely, you'll see all that detail. So that's on store.gamersnexus.net. Let's get into it. First one, the Crimson Pinch. It says, are there any plans to restock, oh, well, there's a store question. Any plans to restock the GN pint glass? They were gone before I could get some. Yes, we have a lot on the way. Demand was really high. Super happy to see it. Sold out in like 16 hours or something. So we have more on the way. They will be here within a week of this going live, if not already in. So thank you for asking, though. We like them a lot, and we'll have more. First real question, then. Steve Streza says, what does watts-per-meter-kelvin mean to a consumer? Is it directly correlated to performance for a given TIM? E.g., a higher number means better thermals. Is it something that casual overclockers should concern themselves with, or is it mostly for the benefit of extreme overclockers? The term has come up several times when talking about various TIMs, and it would be useful to know how we as consumers should be using that information. This is a pretty good one to start the episode off with, and I think it's a great question. So like anything, first off, measuring thermal conductivity, watts per meter Kelvin, it's not universally accepted how that's done between the different OEMs and manufacturers and thermal paste makers. So just like anything else, measuring fan dB, stuff like that, you might have some variance in how they do it. So numbers aren't necessarily directly comparable between each other, although there are absolute standardized methods to take thermal conductivity measurements. Doesn't mean everyone does it that way. So there's no like overarching governmental standard saying you have to do it this way for thermal paste. So that's the first note. Second note, strictly speaking, no, it is not always directly correlated to performance. So here's the thing. If you have a perfectly controlled environment, which never happens with a computer, if you have like absolute perfect conditions, this is straight theory. In straight theory, yes, something with a higher specific thermal conductivity than its competitor will outperform said competitor, all else being equal. So when I say all else being equal, this contains things like viscosity of the paste, contains things like the curing time of the paste, how long does it take to cure and harden, and that can affect its performance either positively or negatively depending on how it's designed. This includes the literal compounds within the compound, is it silver, diamond, ceramic, whatever, and stuff like that. So we're assuming a lot of things are identical. And if you assume everything's basically identical and the only difference is the thermal conductivity, specific thermal conductivity, then yes, the one with the higher number will be better. But that's not how it works in the world of computers. So in the world of computers, and we've tested this, so some of this we haven't published it, maybe one day, but so we've done testing on thermal paste. I've done some testing for individuals who had specific questions about how they perform, and I've found in actually a lot of scenarios, something like a 5 watt per meter Kelvin paste will perform the same as a 12 watt per meter Kelvin paste. It's not to say either one's better or worse, but we're ignoring everything like curing time and how well does it age and how easy is it to spread and stuff like that. I'm misspeaking a lot because I'm really tired and it's 3 a.m. and we're moving an entire studio, sorry. So all of that notwithstanding, like I said, we've tested 4 or 5 watt per meter Kelvin pastes the same in performance as the higher ones. And the reason for that is because computers are really complex. There are a lot of variables. There's a really good chance that unless you're pushing a lot of watts through the CPU, that is, and maybe you're delidded or soldered and you have a good interface and a good cooler and good cooling and airflow and everything, unless you have all that stuff, including the high wattage going through the CPU, you might not actually realize a difference in performance. I mean, it's one of the last things you can change in the line of cooling to try and improve performance, because you kind of do the obvious thing first. You get a big cooler, and then you get a CPU that makes sense thermally, get a case with good airflow, and maybe you delid, maybe you put liquid metal. All of these things you would do first before just only buying higher end paste. And I don't mean like literally, because buying higher end paste is so easy that it might be a first thing you'd try for a lot of people. So there are a lot of other things that can sort of bottleneck the performance, and you'll see the same performance, and so then it's all kind of irrelevant. Other than things like curing time and aging. So certain pastes age a hell of a lot better than others. You might notice that, and I think someone asked about this in one of the episodes, might notice that video cards, if you've had it for a few years, you take it apart, you put new thermal paste on it, it's an easy way to immediately improve the thermal performance by a couple degrees in the least under the same thermal test conditions. And that's because the paste ages and hardens and cracks and gets useless. So curing and aging is a huge consideration, but we're not talking about that, are we? We're talking about the thermal conductivity. So other notes here that I took on this, other than all the variables, I had a note from VSG, who these days does a lot of work for Tech Power Up, but also has his own site, Thermal Bench, and is a thermodynamics expert, we'll call him. So VSG noted, we should actually define what does watts per meter Kelvin really mean. And it is thermal conductivity, but what does that mean? So his note to me was this. I was asking him what's the best way for me to illustrate this. And he was saying the M, as in watts per meter Kelvin, we're defining all the letters. The M is a single length dimension that comes from A over L, surface area and thickness. Thermal conductance is basically the amount of heat in watts passing through a given time on a material of 1 meter squared area through 1 meter of thickness that has two sides L offset in temperature from each other by 1 K. So breaking that down, thermal conductivity, important part here. Thermal conductivity is conductance times L over A, where L over A are going to be thickness and surface area in that order. And also note that K in this case is delta T, and that the watts part here, so heat is measured in just joules for energy, but to express it for this equation, we're expressing it as a rate of change of heat in watts by keeping track of the time. So once you go from joules to watts by taking a time element and tracking that. So over a period of time, we're from joules to watts. So watts per meter Kelvin is more or less defined as that. If you want to visualize it, hopefully that helps you out. So going back to the heart of your question, though, and thank you, VSG, for the answer. Going back to the heart of your question of is it directly related to thermal performance for a given TIM? Yes, except in the world of a million variables in a computer, at which point you're going to run into so many other things first that you might not even realize a gain. Or you might have a huge gain. It just depends. So for example, last example I'll give before moving on. I noted that there are times we've seen same performance, 12 and 5 watts per meter Kelvin paste. The opposite also happens. You can do paste directly under the die of a CPU, or sorry, directly under the IHS on top of a die of a CPU, and see bigger differences there than you might see with paste on top of the IHS with a lidded CPU with limited cooling capabilities or something like that, because you're gonna run into so many other problems and things you can improve first. Also, margin of error is huge for that kind of testing, because you have things like human error and application of the paste too. So anyway, a lot of things to consider with testing pastes. Just watts per meter Kelvin doesn't make it better, just like just horsepower on a car doesn't make it better, or just watts on a power supply doesn't make it better. There are a lot of other factors to consider, and the biggest one is how well does it age, and does it harden over time. So some pastes are better built for that than others. Next one, Brammm says, when asking, oh, okay, that was just a joke. On a more serious note, Brammm said, regarding the office, can you share some plans, previews of how you want to decorate the sets? Are you going to go all stylish like LTT, all humble brag like Jay, or something else? You've mentioned the tables and the tool wall, and in previous video, you mentioned Adam Savage's workshop. Any plans to try building something like that? To build something like Adam Savage's workshop, I think you need to be in the business for like decades and have millions of dollars and a lot of space. I do really like his workshop. It's cluttered as hell, but it's organized chaos, and he seems to know where everything is, and it suits his style perfectly. I'm not trying to emulate that. I admire it and find it very interesting and fun to look at everything he has, and think it's a great set. But so first thing we're going to do is move this stuff all over. So we will at least be starting with the same set, except this shelf is going to be a functional shelf elsewhere in the office. So I don't think this shelf will be in the shot. We might have something in its place. I don't know. I don't know if we're going to be shooting at this like kind of 45-degree angle anymore. I really like it. It's different. It's interesting. But we have the space to shoot straight against a wall now, which means we can have some depth to the shot. So I can have cool stuff on a table behind me and a table in front of me, maybe with cool stuff on it, tool wall, live streaming station with an amazing 8-foot table plus a sick Husky workbench behind it. So we have a lot of options. Decorating, I am sticking to the sort of industrial look that we have, and I really like it. I find that function makes a lot of sense. I like that the sets are places I can work and do things that I would do when the cameras are off, and I think that looks great because it's so natural that it just everything makes sense. Like if I put tools on the wall that I actually use and I know where they are, it feels like it's not being a poser. It's something we actually work with daily, and I find that more relatable when you're viewing the video, that like, oh, these guys actually use that stuff, and I don't know, it's not just a prop. So that's my approach. We are getting some wall art and stuff like that for around the office. I don't know how much will be in the sets. I ordered some silicon wafers that are really cool. So we have silicon wafers coming in from old AMD parts. I couldn't tell you what they are, to be honest. They weren't listed on there. But old AMD parts, old Texas Instruments parts, stuff like that. So that'll be cool wall art. And probably a couple posters. I was kind of playing with the idea of like vintage posters that might be kind of funny today, like advertisements for hard drives that are 1 megabyte or something like that. I thought that'd be kind of interesting, but I don't know if it'll be in the sets or not. Might just be kind of a cool thing to walk into when you come into the office. So yeah, I don't know. It's more or less going to be the same to start, same wall color and everything. And then we'll expand it. If you have ideas of like, I don't know, anything from wall art to physical like hardware pieces that might be interesting in the background, let me know. But we are keeping a functional look to start with. I considered projecting our logo onto the wall and then tracing it with paint. Like, I mean, just like the not this logo, but the teardown logo that's on the mod mats. Considered projecting onto the wall and painting over it, then turn the projector off, obviously, and we'd have a cool logo painted on the wall, but I don't know that I have the patience for it, and I think it'd be difficult, and I'm not particularly trained in that, so I don't think we'll do that. But anyway, some stuff I thought about. Next one, Swift Silver said, if I passively cool my whole PC, CPU, GPU, power supply, will it heat up my room any or at all? Only insofar as reducing your cooling efficiency might have some more power leakage, and it's so minimal that it's nothing to consider. So this is actually a really interesting question, and I think it's kind of hard to initially wrap your head around this concept, and I'm sure most of you already know the answers to this, but so let's start with power leakage. If you cool a CPU less efficiently, for every 10 degrees difference, there's roughly 4% power leakage. So yes, technically your room will get hotter, but you're almost definitely not going to notice. You're talking like potentially single-digit watts, depending on the power of the component that you're cooling. So let's just say no. Let's just say the answer to the question is functionally no. Any increase you will not notice. But this is a bigger topic of cooling. I mean, I remember years and years ago, before we started doing any kind of testing, before I was really doing this, I remember learning that cooling your CPU better didn't make your room cooler or didn't reduce the amount of heat coming out of the PC beyond the power leakage. And I just thought that was the coolest thing, because really any heating or cooling system, all it's meant to do is move the heat around. It's to get it the hell away from the silicon components so they can operate efficiently and out of the case and into whatever the environment is, a room or out the window or whatever. So yeah, if it's not going, like the CPU running cooler doesn't mean that the room will be cooler. It's producing the same amount of heat, again, ignoring leakage, producing the same amount of heat, using the same amount of power, and all that's happening is you're getting that heat away from the CPU faster and more efficiently, and so the CPU can run cooler and the heat's still getting dumped into the room. And that's all there is to it. You're moving heat around. That's all any kind of cooling system is, basically ever. You can't destroy the thermal energy, you can't destroy the heat, so it's going somewhere, and that's going to be into your room. But yeah, the difference is, again, it's going to be about 4% on every 10 degrees on the CPU alone. So you're potentially single-digit watts, maybe double digits with a really high-end CPU that's pushing a lot of power. So no real difference. We did tests, by the way. It was one of our least viewed videos from last year, sadly, because it was a really cool one. It was about like impact of, I don't know, multiple GPUs on room temperature or something like that. And it was interesting. So I set up like a mining rig for a couple days, and we do a test, turn it off, let the entire room cool down for a few days, whatever, and test again. And what I did was keep adding GPUs, and it wasn't the most scientific test in the world, but it was a test of how much heat gets put out into the room via power consumption, and at what point does that affect the like the human comfort level in the room? When do you start actually getting room temperature increases? And we did some tests where we got like nearly runaway scenarios with 1,000, 1,500 watts. I can't remember. I want to say it was like 1,000 watts or something. It was one of the worst ones we did with 5 GPUs, I think. And after just a couple hours of that, without AC on, and with the room all closed, it was something like 10 degrees warmer, which is just really interesting, I think, personally. It's not 100% related to your question, but it's an offshoot that is interesting. Might be worth watching that one. When it was only like 2 GPUs. So the heart of the test for that one was, how does people always talk about 1070s and Vega 56 back then anyway, and talk about how, well, the 1070 draws less power, so my room will be cooler. We saw a lot of that on Reddit and elsewhere. And I was like, okay, but I want to test that. Is that true? Is there any validity to 50 watts difference making that much of a difference in your room temperature? The answer is basically no. So that was a fun test, but anyway, that's completely sort of unrelated to your question. Might be something you guys find interesting, though. Next one, Savage said, should you replace the thermal paste on graphics cards that are a few years old, even if they're high-end models? Also, would the thermal pads be reusable, or would new ones of similar thickness need to be purchased? Thermal pads first. You should always replace thermal pads on your GPUs with same thickness thermal pads. If you must replace them, use the same thickness pad. If you use let's say it's a 1 millimeter pad originally, and you put 1.5 on there, because that's all you have around, you can start creating bowing in the PCB when you remount the cooler, because it'll apply pressure it was not designed to apply in the area where that pad is. And you can have things like, if it's got HBM, it's pretty easy to mess up the HBM. I don't know if it's a cracking within the interposer, or if it's like traces are getting messed up or cracked or whatever's happening. I'm not positive what precisely happens, but I've done it personally, where if you put a pad in that's too big and you clamp it down and it's too much pressure in one spot, and it's got HBM especially, you can start getting video artifacting that's unsolvable, because there's now a physical hardware defect from bowing of the PCB. So it's something we've done. and I would advise against it. You want to replace the pads with the same size pads if you do have to replace them. And replace them should only really do if they're so torn up after tearing it down, the card that is, if the pads are so torn up that they're not really reusable, or if they have a bunch of dust on them. That happens a lot. If they feel hardened, if they don't produce grease anymore, they're supposed to, when they get hot, then those are all valid reasons to replace them. Or if they just suck, that's a good one too. Thermal paste, should you replace thermal paste that are on cards a few years old? I don't know if you should. It depends on how good the card and the cooler were originally. Just do some kind of test and decide. If you didn't have log data before, that kind of sucks because then you can't make a perfect comparison. But do a test, ad hoc test, decide if you're happy with it or not. And if you're happy with the thermals, then who cares? Leave it alone. There's no reason to take it apart unless you really want to. And if you're not happy with the thermals, give it a shot because there's a good chance, yes, it will improve. So should you? The answer is no. The answer is you don't have to. Should you depends on if you like doing that kind of thing. I would, because it's fun and it's not difficult. And if you've never taken apart a video card, it's so easy. It's a couple screws. The hardest thing you can do is use the wrong tools, which I did on this channel years ago when I started taking apart cards. So I get it, but just use the right tools and it's pretty easy and it's fun. High-end models, yeah, high-end models are plenty capable of using cheap thermal paste. We've seen it. Next question is from Metallus, who says, your opinion about corrosion from liquid metal on a copper heatsink. I'm getting the new ThrottleBook Pro. Nicely done. I want to squeeze out every bit of performance I can get, but I've read many things about corrosion on copper heatsinks. I don't want to damage the expensive thing. First of all, for a laptop, you don't have to use liquid metal. Like if it's any kind of direct die cooling, really liquid metal is not necessary at all. You can just use like a high-end thermal paste that has a long lifetime. Like it doesn't age very much. It's not conductive. That's a big thing. Something like Cryonaut, I'll note they are an active advertiser with us, but it is something I would genuinely use, hence asking them to be an advertiser and not someone else. So Cryonaut or an equivalent paste from a competitor would be good for that. Just avoid stuff that is electrically conductive, things that have silver in them. You avoid things that have any kind of like metal in them, and it'll be fine to use. Like it's not going to hurt anything because you're not going to short anything. Liquid metal really comes into play when you're bridging the die to an IHS to a cooler, because then you have a lot of thermal interfaces and it's going through more layers of stuff, which means it's less efficient at transferring, so it can really use the help. If you're direct die, you're already so close to the CPU with the cooling element that you should just use thermal paste in most cases. So liquid metal might help. Let's say you're like, but I want the best and I'm willing to do it, and it's not a big deal. So okay, if you're willing to do it, corrosion then is the question. Damaging metal with liquid metal is certainly going to happen if you apply it to aluminum. Let's get that out of the way first. If you put liquid metal, like gallium, indium, conductonaut mixture or something like that, on aluminum, it will eat away at the aluminum. There will be damage, and you won't like it, and it won't be good. So don't do that. If you put on copper, I'll remind you, an IHS is copper. It's nickel plated. So the nickel plating on the IHS helps keep the worst you get is some visual, just visual artifacts, I guess, visual deformity, where with an IHS that's nickel plated, you wipe the liquid metal off, it comes off 80% of the way, and you have some just gray left behind. It's not a big deal, it doesn't impact thermal performance really, but it's left behind, and I can see how that would concern people, but there's no pitting or anything like that. If you start putting it on copper, so we did this with the Rocket Cool, I don't see it because we're moving, but the Rocket Cool IHS, the just basically pure copper one, the exposed copper one I should say, with no nickel plating, you put on copper, it will stain it. It shouldn't typically pit it. I haven't tested every liquid metal, but for conductonaut, you shouldn't get physical damage with like pitting and corrosion and stuff like that. You'll get staining for sure, but you can wash most of it off with acetone. You'll still have a silver stain there basically forever once you apply it. It's not going to hurt thermal performance in any meaningful way. We've looked at that in our own testing, never published it because didn't really see a need to, didn't do it for publication. We just did it to see if that was something we needed to be worried about when we were doing controlled thermal tests and things like that. So no, I would use something like Cryonaut or whatever's equivalent from competitor, non-conductive and good, and doesn't crack too soon. But if you use liquid metal, you know, it'll stain it, but it's not going to corrode it. Just keep it off of the aluminum and keep it away from anything you can't short or arc. Two more. Kintustis says, I have a few questions about power efficiency in CPUs. Would it be more efficient to run a CPU at a higher percentage load at a lower clock, or at a lower percentage load at a higher clock? For example, does a 2 GHz CPU running at 100% load use less power than the same CPU at 4 GHz under 50% load, assuming the same type of workload? We're assuming a whole lot of things here, more than just workload, but it's a fun question, so let's do that. So for power efficiency with CPUs, we have a great content piece on Ryzen 2000 series where we did a volt frequency curve and the efficiency of that curve. So we basically, Patrick Latham did a lot of this work, he's on my team, and plotted the voltage requirement to sustain a given frequency, and then what is the minimum voltage required to maintain those frequencies as we continue to overclock the chip. And what we found was that it's more or less an exponential curve. It kind of, if you plotted it out, it kind of goes like this, and eventually it just gets so steep in voltage requirement, voltage on this axis, frequency on this axis. Eventually the voltage requirement gets so steep that you can no longer increase the frequency without something like LN2 or exotic cooling. And Der Bauer did his own version of this test with LN2 and found also an exponential curve, but with a much higher frequency than we were doing. But it applied pretty much universally. So getting back to your question then, power efficiency always goes out the window when you start overclocking. So especially if you're overclocking by like a gigahertz plus. So if you're overclocking, it requires exponentially more power to keep, or V-core I should say, to voltage, to keep pushing the frequency, and you lose a lot of your efficiency there. It's never going to be, well, I shouldn't say that. In most cases, let me give you a real example just to cover my answer here, because I'm not going to say it's never going to be more efficient or less, whatever, because there could be a CPU out there where it is more efficient to do that. But let's just take like an 8086K or 8700K. If you take that from 4.7 gigahertz stock with max boost and push it to 5.1, I can't really think of a scenario where the performance gain from overclocking is going to outweigh the efficiency loss from overclocking. That doesn't mean it's not worth overclocking. It doesn't mean it's not worth getting the task done faster. It might well be, but it's not going to be more power efficient if you take that specific processor in that scenario and do it, because the voltage requirement is just, it's so extreme once you start pushing those higher clocks that efficiency goes out the window. So, yeah, you're talking about on a, let's say, a 30 to 40 minute render test, which we've done for overclocking to max potential clock, often it's on an order of magnitude of like 10% improvements at best in a lot of cases. Some CPUs are more extreme, but that's kind of what you're looking at, whereas power consumption could easily be 2x. So hopefully that answers your question pretty well. Doesn't mean you shouldn't do it, just means that you don't do it because you think you'll be saving energy. N7 Trekkie, last one. I just saw that you show your Patreon revenue publicly. Not many creators do this, and I applaud you for it. Do you think this level of transparency will go away in the future as you grow? This is something I've thought about a lot. The answer is, if people abuse it, then yes. So we've had some things. We used to publish a lot more information about what we do and how we operate and stuff like that, and people in the community abused it and tried to use it to attack us without actually validating whether what they were saying made any sense. An example would be when we were doing 30-second test runs for a lot of the games we were benchmarking, and the whole AMD community piled on us basically saying that all of our testing was invalid regarding the Ryzen launch because the 1800X was completely unimpressive from a price to performance standpoint, even though I said the 1700 was an amazing CPU. But that's the community. So the thing is, I didn't publish it till a year later for competitive reasons, but a year later we started the, what was it called? Bench Theory series. And in that video and article series, I showed that with our testing, with the games we test, the 30-second tests produced the same results as testing for a minute or 5 minutes or longer. And that's because, believe it or not, we actually do look into these things. We don't just pick a number and go. So it actually was validated before we ever started doing the tests. But the community in that instance was looking for something to bludgeon us with. And we published a lot of our testing methodology because we believed in that transparency, and people used it to attack us without anyone checking to see whether they knew what the hell they were talking about. Turns out they didn't, because I was able to prove that the methodology was completely valid. And I already knew that, but we didn't publish that data until a year later for competitive reasons, because we didn't want to publish it until we changed everything in our testing methods, which are now different than they were then, but I haven't published that either, again, for competitive reasons. And once we revise that method, we'll publish the previous year's or current year's methods in this case. So that's an instance where providing more information, although probably a net good in the area of test methodology and something that I do want to do, it can bite you, and not even in ways that are justified. So that, yes, transparency goes away as people abuse the transparency. And there are competitive things to consider. There's stuff we don't publish. There's stuff that we don't share for how we test because we don't want competition to do the same thing and catch on. And, it gives us an edge. It lets us do what we do and be unique and do our own thing and create our own market and all this stuff. So there's always going to be stuff that we don't share. Like software that we've built for console testing, for example. We do console benchmarks now. We're not going to publish that and give it away because we spent years figuring it out, like in terms of just like building the experience to build the software. I'm not saying the software didn't take years, but the experience did. So we don't just share all that stuff. But I am slowly starting to add more and more to the methodology sections back in, even after getting burned for it before, because I do think it's the right thing to do. And I do like the idea that if something's wrong, people in the community can validate and help us figure it out so that we can correct the information if there needs to be a correction, even though it's really extremely rare. But the fear, of course, is that when you're asleep or on the other side of the world or whatever and you can't address the problem, someone's going to take that information and run to the outrage culture machine on the internet and create this big story out of nothing and bludgeon you with it. So it's a balance between, do I want to share because it's the right thing to do? Well, there's three things to balance. If you could have a scale with three things on it, a triangle scale, I guess. You have competitive concerns, you have community concerns, and then you have doing the right things concerns. And it can't just all be doing the right thing, because then you lose all your competitive advantage and you potentially expose yourself to get attacked in ways that actually aren't based in reality or anything else. Like, there's a difference between getting criticized for doing something incorrectly or maybe being able to improve something and getting shamed and attacked publicly for something you're not doing wrong. So you got to balance all those things, and I'm constantly learning how to do it better, and we're trying to get back to sharing more of the methodology because I do like sharing that, and I think it's very interesting for people who don't test hardware all day to know what goes into it. So yeah, all of that from your question of Patreon revenue publicly, I like most of it. I'm not going to like post our revenue information or how much people get paid or anything like that because it's not anyone's business. But I am happy to show the Patreon revenue publicly because it is a community-funded platform, and I think if the community is giving that money, then the community has a right to know how much money they're giving us so that when they see us doing all the stuff we're doing, there's a really clear link where you're like, oh, I'm helping pay for that. I'm helping pay for them to do fan testing. I'm helping pay for them to hire people. I'm helping pay for them to get an office where they actually have space to not bump into each other physically. So that I think makes the most sense to keep open and transparent, as long as people don't abuse that transparency. That's kind of all I'm really looking for. So anyway, also, problem with money and knowing how much someone gets is that what you don't know is how much we spend. So there's something Linus talked about before where sharing information like Patreon revenue publicly, if you're someone like Jim Sterling or someone who makes $12,000 a month on it, we don't know his expenses. His profit could be pretty low or it could be really high. So people will see that number of $12,000 a month for someone like Jim Sterling and think, holy crap, that guy's loaded. But, and I don't know what his case is, but in our case, there are a hell of a lot of expenses. So there is a bit of a danger where people will see a number. We're at something like, I don't even remember, to be honest. I think we're at like 5,000 public revenue on Patreon right now per month. And it looks really good and it's very helpful. But you have to remember that, you know, I'm spending multiples of that on things like moving, payroll, inventory, travel, all that stuff monthly. So anyway, yeah, that's it for this one. I'm going to start moving this over, edit the David Cantor interview. Thank you for watching. Patreon.com/GamersNexus to help us out directly. You can go to store.gamersnexus.net to pick one of our mod mats, shirts, cubes, cool video card anatomy posters. We still have a couple in there that are randomly signed. You might get lucky and get one. I signed 10. And yeah, subscribe for more. I'll see you all next time.